There's someone who's going to be speaking here, Neshe Devanote. I'm a big fan of hers. She's written some really important papers on the influences of capitalism and those business forces on psychedelics and how they are trampling on indigenous wisdom and a lot of what's been learned in the counterculture before the business guys saw dollar signs and came in. And so I want to give a shout out to Neshe, and she's going to be talking tomorrow. And this is her latest paper there on the right. And this is about how the same people who are funding AI are funding a lot of the psychedelic stuff and what these guys' beliefs are about how they're in the vanguard of the evolution of consciousness and they're going to be like the superhumans who go off planet as cyborgs, and they want to accelerate income inequality and destruction on the planet because that's part of what supposedly evolution is pushing for. So these are kind of crazy ideas that are actually funding a lot of the psychedelic research in companies and the philosophies and the visions they have for what this is about, even as they talk about, quote, solving the mental health crisis.
All right, so I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Neshe Devanote, a senior lecturer in writing at Johns Hopkins University who has contributed to the interdisciplinary field of psychedelic studies since 2010. They completed a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of Bioethics at the Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine and received their PhD in comparative literature from the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Devanote's scholarship explores the intersection between health, humanities, psychedelic bioethics, neuroethics, and comparative literature. They were a 2015-16 research fellow at the New York Public Library's Timothy Leary Papers and a research fellow with the New York University Psilocybin Cancer Anxiety Study, where they participated in the first qualitative study of participant experiences. Dr. Devanote's book project on the role of narrative and literary devices in psychedelic experience is under contract with Columbia University Press. They're affiliated with Harvard Law School, Petri Flom Center's project on psychedelics law and regulation, the Ohio State University Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education, the Intercollegiate Psychedelics Network, the Psychedelic Educators Network, and Symposia. So without any further ado, Dr. Devanote.
So we're actually start out with a poll, just jumping straight into it. No pressure, not a test. But I have a question that asks, how likely is it that billionaires' psychedelic experiences will lead to positive social and environmental changes on a global scale? Very likely, somewhat likely, neutral, somewhat unlikely, or very unlikely. Interesting mix we have. Very good. So we'll be thinking about this question over the course of the next half hour or so. This is me a long time ago. I got involved in the field, as Dr. Williams mentioned, back in 2010. There's a picture of me volunteering for MAPS at a conference, and also pictures of me after the Psychedelic Science Conference in 2013 and 2017, when I was invited to the invitational researchers meetings that were held at the time. So I was very much an insider back in those early days, very much focused on the positive potentials, which I am very sold on, that psychedelics are very powerful healing substances in the right conditions. And yet, my time in the field over the years, I've seen more and more concerning things, especially disconnects between the stated goals and values that the field is working towards, and then the systems that are getting built to deliver those values to society. And as part of that more and more critical orientation, and critical from a nuanced perspective, as I'm saying, I'm not anti-psychedelics by any means. I have just this past 2 weeks launched what is arguably the first big humanities project, psychedelic humanities project out of Harvard since it received its $16 million grant just at the end of last year. This was a year in the making critical series of a lot of the under discussed topics that I think are really important if this field is going to be a positive force in the world moving forward. A lot of my work in this critical vein has been critiquing the psychedelic hype. And by hype, I'm talking about the overemphasis on the potential benefits and underemphasis on the potential for risks. some of the concerning, hyped rhetoric I've seen around psychedelics has promised that psychedelics are going to be solutions for literally all of the world's most pressing existential problems, including the mental illness epidemic, increasing political polarization, rising fascism, accelerating climate change. But behind that list, there's a recurring factor, which is inequality in society. Inequality is driving all of those things, which means that if we build a psychedelic field that is going to contribute to inequality, we are going to be directly contributing to the very issues that we are claiming to be solving here. Other scholars have emphasized the extent to which psychedelic hype is increasing the likelihood of harm by underemphasizing the actual risks associated with psychedelic substances and their varied contexts. But I'm arguing it's also fueling inequality under the current conditions of the field. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. So I wrote a recent paper comparing the AI, artificial intelligence hype, with the psychedelic hype, in part because I started noticing, especially after ChatGPT, a lot of parallels between my work and the work of critical AI scholars, many of whom were being written off as anti-AI, as people who have careers in that field. They were not anti-AI. They were concerned about the combination of AI and capitalism, just as I am pro-psychedelics, but very concerned about capitalistic approaches with psychedelics. A lot of this gelled in my head when I found this Naomi Klein article where she was critiquing the AI hype, and she was mentioning if we lived in a different world, AI could be a very powerful tool for connection, research, creativity, learning information. But as she says, in today's reality of hyper-concentrated power and wealth, AI is much more likely to become a fearsome tool of further inequality. And she emphasizes that list of problems that I showed at the beginning, they're not actually mysteries how to fix those issues, but the people who have a lot of the power in society, they want to sell simple solutions that don't challenge the fundamental order of society that's benefiting them. And so they're selling AI and psychedelics as another profitable option. But as Naomi Klein says here, we know what it would take, but it's not a quick fix. It's a paradigm shift. Waiting for a more profitable answer is not a cure for the crisis, it's one more symptom of the crisis. So as a result of noting these parallels and seeing a lot of similar language and how the hype was operating around AI and psychedelics, I ultimately argued that they were like two blooms from one plant. The same Silicon Valley and venture capital forces are investing enormous amounts of capital to develop both as cultivars in their own image, selecting for desired traits that further the existing socioeconomic order. And here's an example of how psychedelics are connecting with Silicon Valley and AI. This was a cover story in the Wall Street Journal from last summer. The article is titled "The Drugs That Power Tech, Ketamine, LSD, Mushrooms." In that article, it mentions that Silicon Valley's billionaires are part of a drug movement that is embracing psychedelics as gateways to business breakthroughs. Among Silicon Valley's tech elite, taking psychedelics is now a practice that has become for many a routine part of doing business, according to the article. And it also quotes someone as saying, taking psychedelics is the fastest path to opening your mind and clearly seeing for yourself what's going on. So I'd like you to remember that line and think about what billionaires might be meaning when they say really seeing what's going on. Some people see this as a good thing. Some people think that, like the overview effect, where people can go into space and feel awed and inspired in looking at how small and precious the pale blue dot of Earth is hanging in the fragile blackness of the expanse of space. The idea that some people have been promoting is that, if you send billionaires to space, if you send billionaires to ego death, they're going to come back, they're going to have more empathy, they're going to use all their power and money to make a better world for everyone. I'm not so optimistic about that. And part of this rationale is widespread. The rationale that billionaires are the locus of change in society is common in Silicon Valley. And this is an example, a quote from Ronan Levy, who was then CEO of Field Trip Health, one of the big ketamine companies. He said, if you only serve rich white men with access to psychedelic therapies, it's going to change them in a way that I think is constructive and positive. And will create an army of people who are more open-minded and more willing to think about how we address the challenges of equity. I know it seems counterintuitive that creating more inequity is going to create equity, but I do genuinely believe that that's a possible outcome here. From my perspective, this trickle-down ecstasis idea that you can get really wealthy, privileged people to just have an experience of interconnection and then want to do better in the world is fundamentally flawed. And even the concept of trickle-down economics is flawed in a similar way, where there is this premise that if you just let the billionaires have all the money, they'll create the jobs, society will function better. But a lot of research has looked at when you give the ultra-wealthy money, they tend to reinvest it in the ultra-wealthy at the expense of workers and people on the bottom of society's hierarchies. I was also in my previous research interested in the idea, because a lot of people would say experiences of interconnection are associated with empathy and caring for other people. But in my right-wing psychedelia paper that I did with my colleague Brian Pace, I actually found evidence that authoritarian beliefs can actually prime people to interpret psychedelic experiences of interconnection as confirmations of status hierarchy. So we're all one with this caste system, and I just happen to be the executive at the top of that allows the whole thing to function. So there's no indication that giving billionaires a lot of psychedelics is going to inherently make them want to challenge those underlying hierarchical structures that we're living under today. And all of this came together in my head as I was working on my AI psychedelic hype paper, when I discovered this concept from the critical AI scholars, Timnit Gebru and Emil Torres. They coined this term TESCREAL that is essentially an overlapping connection of different ideologies that not all billionaires, for example, will believe every aspect of this, but there's a lot of Silicon Valley that does subscribe to this general overview trend. And I'm not going to go into the whole concept, but it links transhumanism, extropianism, singularitarianism, cosmism, rationalism, effective altruism, and long-termism. The transhumanist long-termism concept is the one I'm going to focus on here. So transhumanism is the idea that humans can evolve beyond its current physical and mental limitations using advanced technologies. And then long-termism is the belief that we have a moral obligation to distant future generations who will ultimately not be human, because a lot of these Silicon Valley billionaires actually believe that we are a larval form of digitized consciousness that only the billionaires are equipped to actually metamorphose us into. And it's our cosmic need to create this digitized consciousness and colonize the stars that is more important than any humans alive today, ultimately. That is the long-term goal of a lot of the people who are running Silicon Valley's tech companies. So with that perspective in mind, I argue that psychedelics are likely fueling Silicon Valley's grandiose sense of its billionaires' cosmic significance. This is something I feel like as a psychedelic scholar, I was able to add to the TESCREAL conversation, because I noticed a lot of overlaps with psychedelic phenomenology and the way that these TESCREAList ideas are being described. And it's also justifying this belief system, justifying the increasing exploitation and control of humanity's common masses at the bottom of the hierarchy. This paper just came out in the Wall Street Journal last week, 7 days ago now. It's the money and drugs that tie Elon Musk to some Tesla directors. And in this article, it mentions that figures close to Musk have attributed, this article and a previous article by the same authors, they've attributed his increasing instability and cruelty to his frequent use of drugs, including LSD, MDMA, mushrooms, ketamine, and cocaine. His friends and some of the directors at his companies have described an expectation to consume drugs with Musk, or else risk upsetting him and losing access to a figure that they see as akin to a king in society today. It includes this chart of some of the directors that are financially tied directly to Musk's companies. And his globally significant companies are overseen by a board with substantial overlapping financial interests and ties to him. These two figures, Gracias and Jurvetson, I mentioned that $16 million grant that Harvard got for psychedelic humanities. Gracias was the person who gave that money. And Jurvetson is another one of the major culturally significant leaders working in psychedelics as well. On January 30th of this year, a Delaware court struck down Musk's astronomical $55.8 billion Tesla pay package on the grounds that their board was beholden to the CEO and allowed him to essentially dictate the terms of that compensation, far exceeding what other CEOs make. And for Musk, he actually justified that high price tag on the justification that his compensation was necessary due to his singular importance for colonizing space. So that long-termist orientation was the rationale for why he needed all that money. And even on a more subtle level, you can see these hierarchical Silicon Valley ideas influencing the way that systems are being built in the psychedelics industry. Another example from Ronan Levy, there was headlines about how Field Trip Health was going to be giving laid off tech workers being fired en masse because of some of the systemic issues I described earlier in the disenfranchisement of labor. They were offering them at least a free month of ketamine therapy to treat job loss, the stress of job loss. But what was really interesting to me was that instead of medicating the distress from job loss with ketamine at wellness clinics, highly paid tech workers could join unionizing efforts to push back against the disposability of labor and join in solidarity with the lower paid precarious gig workers on which these Silicon Valley industries depend. And when I talk about low paid gig workers, this is what I'm talking about. Silicon Valley depends on a vast tasker underclass that is annotating or making legible to computers the amounts of data that are building AI. So increasingly, there's a concern that as AI becomes more and more dominant, it's not that jobs are going to go away. We're just going to be servicing the AI. And already they're using widespread refugees and other victims of oppression to even train AI mapping so that guided bombs can bomb the streets where they used to live. It's a very dystopian situation. And this is the future that billionaires are trying to build, including Christian Angermeyer, who's one of the biggest psychedelic investors involved in both Atai Life Sciences, but also an early investor in Compass Pathways. He acknowledges that the world that the elites are building is bad for mental health. And he says, I know because I'm doing it. I'm building these systems. And he says, we need to use psychedelics to help people like their new data annotation jobs, essentially. And he even goes so far to say, using psychedelics, we might eliminate the need for retirement because we can get people to work until they're dying and serving this machine. Then there's Sam Altman, who is behind ChatGPT. He's also on the board of Journey Collab, a psychedelic medicine company that's been praised for its indigenous reciprocity initiatives. And yet Altman is a transhumanist long-termist. This is a quote from Twitter. We can colonize space. We can get fusion to work and solar energy to mass scale. We can cure all human diseases. We can build new realities. We are only a few breakthroughs away from abundance at scale that is difficult to imagine. It's obviously better to save 1 million lives in the future than one life today. And I'll come back to that idea in just a second. But in the meantime, I wanted to point out, as I was finishing my paper, I heard about at Psychedelic Science 2023 last summer, there was an indigenous protest at the end of the conference that was buzzing on social media. And I realized that this was essentially a microcosm of the tensions in my paper, because we have Angermeyer having a fireside chat with Rick Doblin, and we have the people who are protesting the appropriation and other capitalization that's going on in the psychedelic field. And what was interesting to me was there was such a rush in a lot of corners of the psychedelic community to paper over those tensions and just acknowledge it as, oh, this is a shadow growth opportunity. We're all coming together. But I really want to urge us to pause and consider how compatible the ideas under the big psychedelic tent actually are. Because I would argue they're incompatible and actually working towards opposite ends in a way that the language is obscuring how contradictory some of these ideas actually are. Long-termism is ultimately incompatible with indigenous reciprocity. From a long-termist perspective, Earth is only here as a source of fuel that we can burn to get off planet and colonize the stars. Climate change is fine because it's getting us to move faster and digitize consciousness. That's all. Every single person is expendable towards this future digitized consciousness. Whereas, like some people have heard, oh, long-termism, thinking about the future. Superficially, it sounds like it might mean something like the Haudenosaunee concept of the seventh generation principles. We should act today in a way that benefits 7 generations out. But ultimately, they're not the same thing, and they're actually opposite. Indigenous scholars working in the psychedelics field have emphasized how indigenous views on well-being, on the well-being of future generations, are commonly rooted in a non-hierarchical ontology based on reciprocity and relationality with the specific local diversity of the more than human world here and now. Indigenous ontology is incompatible with neoliberal capitalism's basis in extraction and exploitation. which is premised on a colonial hierarchization of life that justifies the exploitation of those on the bottom by those at the top. And I just want to end by explaining some of my concerns here. There's a lesson to be learned from the early internet, I would argue. This is a quote by Douglas Rushkoff. He was an early optimist about tech, and he was outspoken about the fact that the internet is going to connect all of us together. It's going to be democratizing force. It's going to be a liberating technology. And it had that potential. It could have been that. But the internet we built is centralized. It's controlled by big tech companies, and not just controlled. They have built out these algorithms, these platforms, in order to control behavior. As he says, this is not just a coincidence that our technologies are now isolating and repressing us. It's not just a coincidence or some circumstantial byproduct of how these platforms function. This is the science of designing for behavior change in a way that is tuned towards making money for those companies. These outcomes resulted from elite decisions that were optimizing for profit, and a different internet was possible. We are now at the beginning of both AI and the psychedelic industry. This is a very sensitive time where a lot of the tech elites would prefer that people buy in to their long-termist vision for where we're headed. But now is the time to say we need to do things differently than orienting towards profit for the most wealthy on the planet. The AI and psychedelics industries are still in nascent phases, and the same utopian hype is desensitizing people from noticing how elite decisions are optimizing both for profit. If we want AI and psychedelics to be used as forces for healing, connection, and expression, now is the time to name and resist the corporate takeover of both industries, because we might not get a second chance. And what I mean by that is that AI is a stochastic parrot technology where the biases that are baked into the language models now are getting seeded and spreading across the internet to the point that we're going to end up having more artificial text than we are text written by humans. And so it's the iteration of those prejudices and biases over and over again that are getting baked into the underlying language of the internet. And similarly, psychedelics are suggestibility enhancing non-specific amplifiers. And so the processes and approaches that we're building into the therapies, into our norms for research and our assumptions about what these drugs are and how they work can get iterated out in a way that people are having experiences that might be primed by what they're being told by people who are working for companies that are trying to make the most money as possible, which is in contradiction, I would argue, to genuine healing. And I'd just like to return now to that first question and ask again, how likely is it the billionaires' psychedelic experiences will lead to positive social and environmental changes on a global scale? Very likely, somewhat likely, neutral, somewhat unlikely, or very unlikely? A bit different from the first time I asked it. Yeah, thank you all. I wanted to just end, because I know I touched on a lot of heady ideas, I wanted to end with something very practical, because I know a lot of people in this room want to work in this industry, have good intentions. What can we do now that doesn't tip the scale towards what the billionaires are trying to do? I would argue that we need to be really focused on responsible, unhyped science communication. An example of this, there was a recent debate on Twitter looking at this article on treating chronic lower back pain with psychedelics. And what was so interesting to me seeing this article is that it's such a systemic factor. I'll tell you what I mean by that in just a second. The journalist's explanation for the problem in this article is just that people are living longer. People are getting old, and so back pain just happens. And there is some truth to that, but that's the only example, the only rationale that's provided. My symposia colleague, Brian Normand, was arguing with Josh Hardman, who's behind Psychedelic Alpha on Twitter, and he made the argument that it's like advertising without mentioning lifestyle, exercise, any issues like that. It's like advertising psychedelics for tooth decay without any mention of brushing, flossing, or sugar. But I actually want to go a layer deeper than that. I would argue at the systemic critique level, it's like avoiding the question of why we have so much sugar in our food in the first place. We need to acknowledge these systemic problems: unwalkable cities, proliferation of sedentary jobs, rampant overwork that leaves little time for exercise. If we don't at least acknowledge that these are factors in the way we're talking about this research, we are carrying water for the billionaires. And just the final point I'm going to end on is Mark Fisher, who has written about capitalist realism, where he says capitalism has gotten to the point that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. This is what I'm most interested in with psychedelics, the potential that we can open up an emancipatory politics where people can imagine a world beyond capitalism that serves all of us, that serves healing, and isn't about a supremacist ideology where some people are allowed to govern us off the cliff of this beautiful planet that we live on. And I hope that you all join me in dreaming up better alternative futures, because a better world is definitely possible. Thank you.
So thank you so much for that compelling and terrifying talk. Um, I just want to start off by saying there are definitely some frightening, disturbing beliefs and visions there. One person was wondering, how do you resist existential despair over all of this?
I mean, it's a very good question. Organizing with like-minded people who really care and have your back is everything to me. I mean, I could not do the work that I'm doing without all of the people who I'm in dialogue, conversation with. And so starting locally, starting where you're at, speaking up for the people who are not able to talk because they're in those data annotation camps and that's all that they can do with their time, and saying, we need to look at the bigger picture. Ultimately, I think that is powerful. I think there's an element, my hope is that there is an element of this where it is like saying the emperor has no clothes. But the more people who are willing to speak up and say it does not have to be this way, we can imagine a better future, can actually help that come into reality. And just really being solid about keeping our eyes on the real goal of healing, of repair, of building trust, building community locally, supporting one another. I think that can't fix everything right away, but I do think it will make a difference.
So my next question is, do you think these billionaires are sociopaths?
Well, there's a lot of really interesting research. It is not healthy for people to be so powerful and so wealthy and so disconnected from the average person's experience. So it's ultimately, I think, a developmental stunting that happens from having too much wealth. When a kid insists and puffs up their chest that they have to have cookies at every meal during the day, we don't say, go ahead and do it. Right now, it's like we have this cultural malaise that's going on where it's as if these billionaires, they're immature, they're stunted in some way, or they wouldn't be behaving like this. And I think that there's just this mythology that they are superior and better than everyone, and we should just do what they say. But ultimately, a healthy society would boundary with compassion, but boundary those kinds of demands and insist on doing things in a more pro-social, pro-environmental way.
Now, yes, thank you so much. So I guess one question that has come up is, can psychedelics create more narcissism? Because it doesn't seem like psychedelics have helped all of these billionaires who are saying they use them.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes psychedelics, just ego death, these types of experiences just make narcissists more narcissistic. I've definitely seen that phenomenon happen. And I think that there has been, in part because of scientists who are looking for funding, some scientists have been feeding the hype machine by really focusing on the positive aspects of psychedelic potential, by focusing on the empathy, focusing on the pro-sociality, in part because that's how they're pitching this as this really exciting field. And I do think the field's very exciting, but I think the field's at a point now where it can take a measured both and approach. And ultimately, the potential to use psychedelics in a way that is pro-social is going to be, I would argue, amplified if we are attentive to the risks and look for warning signs, and also think about how some of the ways that we are talking about psychedelics might actually be encouraging narcissistic and grandiose types of outcomes that could otherwise be checked, noted, steered away into different directions. So I think we're at a really, I would argue, dangerous time in this field because there's so much grandiosity, so much claim to world healing and world saving, and so much money potentially at stake. I mean, as someone who's been in this field since 2010, it was a very different field back then. It was very small. There wasn't money pouring into the field. But I would just say, from my perspective, I'm a humanities scholar. I'm not a scientist. I've collaborated with scientists. And I really think that the power that science has had in this field has, in my experience, been at the expense of a lot of other really important ideas and ways of knowing. And that the only way we're going to be able to think about these potential blind spots in the field, like maybe sometimes psychedelics might encourage narcissism, maybe there might be risks when we're amplifying ideologies uncritically, the more that we incorporate diverse perspectives, both background, life experience diversity, but also disciplinary diversity. I went to a lot of conferences as a grad student where I would notice that the scientists would have they were treated kind of like rock stars. They'd have their red carpet rolled out. And I could see, being a humanities scholar, how much lower I was seen by a lot of the people in the room, in the field, the powerful people. And I think that's part of why we've gotten to this place. Is the field itself has hierarchies that I think we need to dismantle and bring in other perspectives and respect people for their differences instead of holding everyone to the same standards.
Yeah, those are excellent points. Thank you. Now, is there a risk, however, that having these critical conversations, that I think these are important, but could it slow down important psychedelic scientific research? Is that a problem?
I don't think it is a problem. I think that eventually the risks and the downsides are going to come out anyway. And if the people who love psychedelics, who care about psychedelics, were the ones to raise those conversations and to think about it and to bring this into the conversation, that looks so much better than if it's the people who don't like psychedelics that are the ones bringing up the critical nuance and those sides of it. And ultimately, I think that by acknowledging that there are risks, that acknowledging it's not all sunshine and rainbows, we can study ways of encouraging the positive outcomes and preventing some of the risks from happening. So ultimately, looking even just a few years down the road from now, I think the more nuance we have now, the better the science will be, the better and healthier the field will be, and the less potential for blowback by people who don't want psychedelics to be accessible.
Now, how might academic institutions support research in these critical psychedelic studies?
Well, so far, I think that a lot of the funding has been for scientists. And I think it's been, in my case, I have since 2010, contributed papers that no one had talked about, the topics I've written about, that have since become subfields in multiple different domains. And in my case, I just this past fall got my first permanent faculty job at Johns Hopkins after 10 years of precarity. I was on the job market for 10 years, cycling through postdocs from a poor background. My family is Indigenous Kurdish. I'm neurodivergent, non-binary, struggled a lot to get to where I am. And the fact that my work was not lifted up and respected by so much of the field until recently is a sign of where things are at. And the only reason I mention that is because it's not just me. I happen to make it, but there are other people who did brilliant work who are no longer in the field because of how they were disrespected, how they were treated, people being harmed and looking the other way when they spoke out. And so I would say, I really would love the field to be a safe, encouraging place where people with different kinds of backgrounds, different kinds of struggles are able to come, show up, speak their mind, and be supported.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful, wonderful having you up here for this important conversation.
So thank you all so much. I'm happy to be here.
So I think we're going to start with either what stood out for us so far, where this is the idea of this is to be somewhat integrative at this moment. So some combination of what has stood out so far and what are the insights that cut across the various presentations.
Yesterday it was wonderful, and today was even more wonderful. It felt like a deepening process. And, you know, Nesse, your talk was just, to me, this idea of contrasting visions really brings, and I think your talk really delivered this idea of clarity of paradigm and discussion of paradigm. And that, it's really easy to get bogged down as clinicians in what dose did you give and when will it be legal and what training program are you doing and which substance and which diagnoses. But I think the talk we just had is just so beautiful in terms of bringing us up to that bigger level, and really the discussions all throughout today, thinking about community. And what's been coming to me, and I guess we could say it's nature, is this idea of the microbiome. You know, we've been talking a lot about gut health in our culture, and this idea of the garden of bacteria. No, they're good ones, they're bad ones, but diversity is really good for the system. And kind of in the same way, thinking about us as an organism in society, the importance of having a diverse microbiome. And I feel like being here has been just a great chance to think about all the different communities. And also, I think the talk that we just had really hit home for me some bigger picture questions around, it's really important to think about the paradigm.
Yeah. I would say, some things really coming up for me across all of this is power, and who has power and how are they wielding it? How is power, as Nashe was saying, who gets the money to do what kind of research? And I think, I'm a person who's been immersed in the trauma field for a long time. And I think the ways we think about trauma in terms of disempowerment and disconnection. And when I think of disempowerment, I think of, undermining people's autonomy, undermining their competence. And that's a lot of what I'm afraid of, is a lot of the psychedelic stuff. There's people with power who are undermining other people who have less money, people who of different races, people, LGBTQ plus people. There's so many different power dimensions that this is playing out, and the trauma lens can help us think about what do we need, who do we need to support, and who do we need to resist. And these guys also have their prefrontal cortex, but their prefrontal cortex is pursuing domination and exploitation of other people. And so I think the trauma lens can really help bridge a lot of these things, and working in local community. That's something that came up when they asked Nashe, like, what can you do? Local community and resist. So I think, we're seeing now, hey, it's going to be approved by the end of the year. Well, MAPS Public Benefit Corporation is now named Lycos. Lycos is wolf. So maybe it's become a wolf in sheep's clothing. And maybe we need to be really careful about how we get involved in any of these corporate things. And maybe we need to focus in our local communities, thinking in terms of trauma and power, to resist people who want to scale and who want to extract wealth. And those are some of the key concepts that I have.
And I guess I'll just add that for me, what really stuck out is the diversity of voices and perspectives. And, and just to piggyback on our last speaker, Dr. Devno, how important all of these voices are, and how we need to make sure that there's space at the table for everyone, especially those who've been marginalized, especially those who don't have the opportunity to share their wisdom and experience, because all of it's needed. And it sounds like there's going to be some really big challenges ahead. I know one of the questions that comes up a lot is, okay, so psychedelics are coming. Are we ready? I would say absolutely not. But we're going to have to get ready, and it's going to be a bumpy ride, and we're going to need all hands on deck, because there's so many different directions this can go, and it's hard to know exactly what that's going to look like until it happens.